So last week, we ended chapter 1 with a sign of hope, right? Very little sign of hope, just a barley festival, which, as I pointed out, new life begins sometimes with the smallest and the seemingly most insignificant types of moments, right? So Ruth, of course, in the midst of their poverty, their grief, everything else, just kind of gets to work, right? That's what a lot of us do. When things are falling apart, we're like, just let me throw myself into my work, right? let me just do this. And she knows that the law allows her to harvest and glean wheat from the edges of the field. And so Ruth is out there. She is not looking for romance, all right? Not what she is doing. She's looking for dinner. She just wants to eat. So the narrator of the book gives us a little bit of a nod, nod, wink, wink kind of thing going on here when they state, as it happened, it belonged to Boaz. Now, readers of this book know nothing in this book just happens, right? But Ruth doesn't know that. But as it happened, the field belonged to Boaz. And as it so happened, Boaz showed up in the field that day. And as it so happened, he took notice of Ruth. He simply happens to show kindness to her. Now, from Ruth's perspective, this is uneventful. It's just like, oh, good. First of all, safety in the field, right? Because he's like, yeah, you're going to get harassed and bothered if you're probably in some of these other fields, so why don't you stick here? And good old Naomi, when she goes home and she tells Naomi what happened, Naomi starts to see what's going on here. She's like, oh, hey. Despite all her grief and all her sorrow, she is able to see through all that in this moment. She can see a ray of hope. She sees a possibility that wasn't there earlier that day, right? Which, given where we left off with Naomi in chapter 1, is kind of amazing. I mean, here's the woman who showed up in town and people were like, hey, welcome back, Naomi. And she's like, don't call me Naomi, call me bitter. Because she was convinced God had turned against her, that her life was cursed. And she felt that way for good reason. I mean, let's face it. She'd had to leave her home country due to a famine. And in this foreign country, then she winds up still losing her son and her two sons and her husband. And with them, of course, all of her economic security. And, just think about how easily the rest of us become convinced that God has turned against us with far less that goes wrong in our lives, right? More than once in my life, I know I was like, God, you are punishing me. Now, that's bad theology, FYI. Bad theology. And the story of Naomi and Ruth helps us understand why that's bad theology. Because God was not punishing Naomi, right? That wasn't what was going on here, even though that's how she felt. She felt she was cursed. Yet despite all the hardship, all the grief, all the sorrow, Naomi now sees a tiny little ray of hope. She sees this little ray of hope in something as simple as Ruth going into the fields and having one of the owners take notice of her. This is like lightning bolt for Naomi to go, whoa, there is opportunity here. Because eventually grief has to ask the difficult question of, well, now what? Where do we go from here? And Ruth carried us through the first chapter while Naomi kind of wallowed in her grief. But now in chapter 2, after Ruth once again takes the reins and gets to work, Naomi starts to wake up a little bit. And instead of the Lord has dealt bitterly with me, we hear, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. That is quite the shift, right? From I am cursed to blessed be God. Naomi is moving beyond the darkness of her grief, and she's starting to see those first rays of hope because she knows something Ruth does not. She knows who Boaz is. She knows he's a relative of her husband's, and he can fulfill what is called the role of the kinsman redeemer, which in ancient Israelite law, a kinsman redeemer was a man who was from the family who had the responsibility to act on behalf of that family member who was in trouble, in danger, or in extreme poverty. So that role involved either buying back lost property, rescuing relatives from slavery, providing heirs for a deceased family member. So now it's Naomi's turn to get to work, right? She's going to play matchmaker. And while this book is titled Ruth, Naomi really is the one who goes through transformation in this story. She really is the one who has kind of the arc. The miracle of this story isn't that Ruth finds grain in order to feed themselves. It's that Naomi finds hope in the midst of her grief and despair. It's almost like resurrection happening inside a person, right? Where they see new life. New life is possible out of the darkness. That the death of her old life is not the end. There is another chapter. And this is how the gospel works, right? This is just the way the gospel works in our lives. If we look to Ruth's future descendants, we, of course, get to Jesus, eventually, who goes around doing what? Restoring people's futures, right? Restoring hope in their lives when hope was seemingly gone. A woman who was bent over for 18 years, a blind beggar beside the road, a tax collector everyone despised, disciples hiding behind locked doors after the crucifixion. In every case, Jesus does more than meet just an immediate need. He restores them to community. He restores their future. He restores hope that they can have life again. When the women came to the tomb on Easter morning, they were not expecting resurrection. They were simply trying to tend to the body. Like Ruth going into the fields, they were just doing the next necessary thing in life to survive. But God was already doing something bigger than they could imagine. The empty tomb is God's declaration that despair never gets the final word. Death never gets the final word. Bitterness never gets the final word. The seeming end of the story is never where God stops writing. When you think you're at the end of everything, God's like, nah, I've got more. At the beginning of Ruth 2, the women are simply surviving. At the end of Ruth 2, we see hope emerging. And we get a little curious. Where is this story going to go, right? Sometimes that's the first miracle that God performs. It's not God changing our circumstances overnight. It's helping us believe that our story isn't over, that we have a future. Helping us to see that there is another chapter, that there is another way forward, and helping us trust that God, who has carried us through loss, is not finished with us yet. For Naomi, hope arrived carrying an armful of barley. For us, hope arrives carrying an empty tomb. And both proclaim the same truth. God is still writing the story. Confident